There we go.
There we go. All right. First of all, thank you everybody for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with such a large, distinguished crowd. Um, First of all, want to introduce myself and thank you, Chef, for introducing me as well. I am Dr. Ramchandani. I work here in Santa Rosa at Redwood Pain Institute. I've been here 3 years. I'm actually born and raised in the Bay Area. And George, if you can go to the next slide. I actually can
Okay,
start the
I'm actually going
slideshow.
to stop this because I got the wrong presentation up.
Oh, you got the
Okay.
old one. Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
So take me a
Got it.
second to get to the new one.
Sure, no problem.
Okay.
I'll start talking about it anyway because it's
Okay, that works.
nothing big. I'm born and raised here in the Bay Area. I was actually raised in the East Bay in Danville, and then, as you heard, I went to Berkeley. Then I made my trip to the Midwest. I went to Chicago for medical school. Then I came back to Stanford for residency, and then went to Texas. Actually, I went to Oregon for a year. Then I went to Texas. Then I came back here because I like the Bay Area and this area so much. So I ended up here in Santa Rosa with myself and my wife and my 2 kids. We live here in Santa Rosa, kind of near Oakmont. I actually run through Oakmont all the time. And still a big Bay Area sports fan, which is nice to have sports back. We'll see how long that lasts. Anyway, going to talk a little bit about viruses today. Viruses are a piece of DNA or RNA that hacks into cells, and what happens is this piece of RNA or DNA gets into the cell and hacks them. So essentially the same thing as a computer virus. A computer virus hacks your computer. This virus actually comes and hacks a cell. And it's contained in a protein shell, and it can hold DNA or RNA. They are not alive. They are technically just a piece of protein. It's amazing how much damage a little piece of protein can do. But they are not able to reproduce on their own, unlike things that are alive. They actually need a host cell to reproduce, and that's why they have to hack into our body in order to reproduce. So this happens with our body as well as other things. Next slide, please. So what is a bacteria? You know, we talk about viruses and bacteria. Bacteria are living things. So viruses are not living. Bacteria are living things. Most can live on their own in specific environments. They can reproduce, not like humans, of course, but they can reproduce. They usually just split into different cells, or 2 cells become 1. But that's how they reproduce. They are slower in growth than viruses, but they grow much quicker than multicellular organisms. Multicellular organisms being like us or other animals that you would consider normal animals. But viruses are not even a cell. They're not even that. So bacteria are cellular. They have a coating on the outside, which is kind of like the skin. It's a hard-to-break barrier that encapsulates the whole organism. So the question then comes is, okay, so do viruses attack bacteria? Or how does that happen? So next paragraph, please. So this is how a bacteria gets a viral infection. So bacteria also get viruses. So you can see how small on this slide it sort of depicts what the virus looks like and what the bacteria looks like. And the virus is much smaller than the bacteria, and you can see that it attaches to the bacteria cell and actually makes the viral protein inside the cell, and then makes new viruses inside the cell, and then it breaks apart the bacteria. So this is how viruses come into bacteria. That is the same way virus can actually come into one of our cells. So this is an important concept as far as how viruses work. Next slide. And this is sort of the same thing. Bacteria can get infected by viruses, and in fact, most viruses attack bacteria, not us. We actually don't know many of the viruses out there. We probably don't know many of the bacteria either. But the bacteria are much easier infected than our cells. We are much more sophisticated as far as our cellular protections and other things. So it becomes a lot harder for a virus to come attack us than it is to attack a bacteria. Next slide, please. So There are several different types of viruses. There are DNA viruses, there are RNA viruses, there are capsulated viruses, and non-capsulated viruses. So the capsulated viruses are actually more, they're more destructive, meaning if they get on the surface, they can be destroyed pretty easily. A non-capsulated virus, on the other hand, is much more stable on surfaces. So a non-capsulated virus, if it's on a surface, it can go to another infective being really quickly. A capsulated virus, on the other hand, usually is on the surface and then dies out pretty quickly. So these capsulated viruses are not very stable, kind of like coronavirus. It's not a very stable virus. I know coronavirus is on everybody's mind. So what is coronavirus? So I'll get into that in a minute. Next slide, please. So the types of viruses. There are many different types of viruses, and just a few things to think about. The common cold virus. There are several different common cold viruses. The rhinovirus is actually the most common cold viruses, and this is probably 30 to 60% of all colds. It usually causes a very mild illness. On the other hand, the rhinovirus is not very deadly. Your regular cold is usually a rhinovirus. The coronavirus, there are many different types of coronavirus, of which we know only a few of, but the coronavirus, many of them just cause a normal cold, and this is very common. It's about 20 to 30% of all colds, and common coronaviruses cause mild illness. So many of us may have already had a coronavirus at some point. Actually, probably all of us have had some sort of coronavirus at some point, and we just are fine. We haven't gotten very sick with it. There's another type of virus that causes common colds, that is RSV and parainfluenza. With children, young children, RSV and parainfluenza can cause quite bad illness, can cause even death. And with parainfluenza, the same thing can go on. So viruses are in those as well. Something that we don't even know about. So 20 to 30% of all colds, we don't even know what's really causing it. So very interesting. Sometimes this virus is something that we don't even know about. We haven't even heard about yet. Next slide, please. Oops, two. Okay, there we go. So there are many viral infections, and I'm focused a little bit more on the common cold and the cold viruses because that's a lot of the viruses that we are dealing with as far as similarity to the coronavirus. On the other hand, there are viruses that can cause infections anywhere in the body. If you think about measles or rabies, that actually causes meningitis and can infect the brain. Pharyngitis is caused by similar things like cytomegalovirus, adenovirus. Cardiovascular system can be affected by Coxsackie-B, which can be a pretty bad infection actually, and can cause some inflammation of the walls around the heart. Hepatitis is also a type of virus, and that can cause A, B, C, D, E. And we sometimes can get immunized against hepatitis B and A, and hepatitis C is pretty common as well. There are also skin infections. We all have heard about the varicella zoster or chickenpox. There's also smallpox, which can be quite severe, and I think you were talking about that a little bit earlier, right, George?
Yep.
Human papillomavirus is also something that we have a vaccine for nowadays. Rubella, measles, we have vaccines for that. There's also sexually transmitted viruses like HIV and gastroenteritis, which is a common thing. Norovirus goes around and infects nursing homes quite often in the United States and actually has outbreaks. And each one of these viruses could have a different way of how it gets into the system. Some of them come through the respiratory tract, some of them may come through other secretions, some of them may just come from skin touch. So that's something to think about as far as how viruses are different, and each one can be very, very different than the other. And there also, of course, we know of poliovirus and how we've eliminated most of polio throughout the world with the vaccine. Next slide. So, of course, viruses can be mild. They can also be quite bad. We think about viruses like Ebola, MERS, HIV, and hepatitis. They can kill people pretty quickly, and they don't all cause respiratory syndromes. And we don't know about every single virus. There are just so many of them and they're so small that we haven't been able to actually test everything. Next slide, please. So a little bit about the influenza virus. The influenza virus is a RNA virus like the coronavirus. It infects birds and humans. There were several different types of influenza viruses. There's A, B, C, and D. A is probably the most common that we hear about most of the time, which is one of them is the H1N1. And this H1N1 was the cause of the swine flu and Spanish flu. There's also H2N3, which has caused pandemics in the past. Influenza B is exclusive to humans. It's usually less common than influenza A. I'm quite familiar with influenza B. My wife actually had it in January. Influenza C can infect humans, dogs, and pigs, and it's less common than A and B. In fact, we don't even have a test for that for the most part. And it causes a mild illness in children. Influenza D does not affect humans at all. Next slide, please. And influenza, for the most part, causes a pneumonia and can cause some more neurological syndromes like disorders of brain and spinal cord, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, stroke, all sorts of stuff, not good things. Most of the time it causes bad illness in children. And adults, it can cause something called Guillain-Barré syndrome, where people have weakness in their extremities, meaning their hands and their feet. But it can go all the way up to the lungs and can cause people to stop breathing. So influenza can be a pretty severe illness as well. Now, we'll talk about that a little bit more in the rest of this presentation. Next slide, please. So we keep talking about a novel coronavirus, but what is a novel virus? So we have viruses that we see all the time, see meaning our body sees all the time. And these may be things like your regular coronavirus, not the COVID-19, or a rhinovirus. And we have an antigenic response, meaning a response from the immune system to a regular virus. On the other hand, these novel viruses, we do not have a response to those viruses. And this can happen with the flu, like a flu pandemic, which has happened in the past, including H1N1, which happened quite recently. And there's an avian strain that mixes with the human strain and can cause the flu to become more virulent and more severe. And then we don't have any way to fight against this because we don't actually have an antigenic response to the virus. Now, the coronavirus can be a little bit more like this because it is like the flu, and it happens with, it can cause multiple pandemics because it's been isolated in bats for the most part. It's kind of new to the human being and hasn't been around for a long time. So that's why this is a little bit more significant and severe. Next slide, please. So this picture here shows what happens with the flu virus. So a highly pathogenic avian strain, meaning something that's pretty bad with birds, mixes with the human strain, and their DNA mixes somehow because these viruses are can mutate pretty quickly. And now we suddenly got a highly pathogenic human strain, kind of what happened with H1N1 and these other pandemics. And this is how we get these severe pandemics. Next slide, please. So coronavirus, like the flu virus, has 4 types, except we don't call them A, B, C, D. We call them alpha, beta, delta, and gamma. And alpha and beta infects humans, bats, and mammals. Delta and gamma don't usually infect humans, birds mostly. Next slide. So coronavirus versus influenza. So influenza is 3 to 5 million severe cases yearly, which is quite a bit. There's likely 50 million cases per year, but we don't report every single case, and there are usually between 300 to 600,000 deaths per year. The Spanish flu, which was in 1918, there were 20 to 100 million deaths. Our case fatality rate, which I'll be talking about in a little bit, is between 5 to 10% for that. We just don't have exact numbers because it was 1918. In 2009, the flu pandemic was about 1 billion infections. There were about 17,000 deaths here in the United States, but a case fatality rate of 0.1%. Now, COVID-19 pandemic, this recent pandemic, there have been 18 million cases with 700,000 deaths approximately. We're in that range. I think we may have hit it today. The case fatality rate based on this is about 3.8%. Although, how do we really know the real caseload? Because we didn't have enough testing initially, and we may still not have enough testing. So we really don't know how many cases. The only thing that we know is that we have 18 million confirmed cases at this point. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit more about coronavirus, because that's the main topic. It was found in the 1930s. So some chickens in North Dakota became listless, and the founder of the coronavirus actually saw this and was like, oh wow, these chickens are going listless. It must be caused by some issue. So there were he found the coronavirus in these chickens. Before SARS in 2003, we found that there were 4 relatively benign coronaviruses that infected humans. In 2003, there was a SARS outbreak, which killed, I think, about 900 people, if I'm not mistaken. MERS in 2012, again, killed less than 1,000 people. But MERS was worse than SARS. And then there was SARS-CoV-2, which is actually similar to SARS. Of course, there's been no vaccine found to date for any of these coronaviruses. And that's the scary part. Next slide. The other thing about the coronavirus is that they evolved very quickly. In 1960, just in 1960, the alpaca and the human coronavirus diverged. So there was a 229E coronavirus, which is a different type of coronavirus. It doesn't cause severe illness. But this was actually in alpacas only, and then it diverged between alpacas and humans and became infecting alpacas separately and humans separately. Very interesting. The NL63 coronavirus, which is another type of not severe coronavirus, has origins in bats between 1200 and 1400 after the death of Christ. That's not that long ago. And then most coronaviruses have origins from bats or birds. But unlike animals and mammals, other beings rapidly mutate to evolve and infect people. This is why coronaviruses may be hard to vaccinate against. If you think about it, it just mutated in 1960. The last true mutation for humans was probably millions of years ago. And for us to evolve and try to fight against something like the coronavirus, these things are quite adaptable and change pretty quickly. The thing is that if we can come out with a vaccine, we'll be in much better shape. So let's talk a little bit more about the coronavirus. Next slide. So the SARS-CoV-2 is a beta coronavirus. We talked about alpha, beta, delta, gamma. So this is a beta coronavirus. It's similar to SARS and MERS. It's more similar to SARS than MERS, and it has a spike protein which attaches to the ACE2 receptor. Now the ACE2 receptor is, we've heard of ACE inhibitors, which are or they reduce blood pressure. So the ACE2 receptor is actually one of the receptors for the ACE inhibitor, and the SARS-CoV-2 attaches to that ACE2 receptor. There's nothing proven at this point that shows that ACE inhibitors can do anything with SARS-CoV-2. But on the other hand, that could be a potential target for drugs. So next slide. So more about the coronavirus. Case mortality rate for SARS in 2013 was about 10%. 2012, the MERS pandemic was about 35%. And the SARS-CoV-2, we still really don't know the mortality rate, despite us guessing, about 3.8% from the statistics, but we, again, don't know the denominator, so our best guess is between 0.5 and 3%. Next slide. So one of the things here, now I'm going to shift gear a little bit and talk about R-naught. And this is how viruses actually get transmitted, and this is the reproduction rate of viruses. So we talk about viruses going into cells and then they go and reproduce. But how do we test and how do we know exactly how much reproduction we're getting and how severe the illness is? So you look at SARS, the first SARS, and that's not on the slide, but this first SARS, the reproduction rate was about 1. So if you look at a reproduction rate about 1, then what's going to happen is that's going to eventually go away, because if we get some immunity to the SARS virus, then it's slowly going to go away. Anything above the rate of 1 is going to increase in number. So when you look at these Oh yeah, SARS is on here. Sorry, it's 1 to 2.75. So it was initially 1, and then somehow it dissipated and went away. SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus that we're currently talking about, is 1.5 to 3. The flu is about 0.9 to 3, and that really depends on the time of year. So that's why flu comes in over the winter seasons and comes up because the multiplication rate goes higher, and then it goes down towards the end of the season. Polio, which was quite severe, was between 5 and 7, and Ebola is between 1.5 to 2.5. So we think about these things, it's pretty remarkable that we were able to get through and kill these viruses off, whichever ones we have been able to. Next slide, please. What is real and which is really true is the RE, or the effective R naught. So R naught is R in a little zero, but I didn't put a little zero here, it's a big zero. So it's the effective R naught. So if we have 1/3 of people with immunity, then the effective R naught, or RE, is lower, making the disease less spreadable. So how do we reduce R naught? That's by doing specific things like washing hands, wearing a mask, and social distancing. If it's something like HIV, it's like having protected sex rather than having not protected sex, and that would reduce the R naught. So if we were to do the above, we can bring the effective rate of SARS-CoV-2, or the COVID-19, right, the thing that causes COVID-19, from 1.5 down to what? Next slide, please. So if we have immunity in our population, so if you have 90% immunity, you can see that if our R naught was even up to a 10, we would actually bring the actual effective R naught down to below 1. So this is how we can get things like measles, because measles has an RE of about 15. So if we have 99% of people immunized against measles, then we can bring the R naught down to below 10. So the more people that we have immunized, the more we can bring down the R naught. The less reproducible the virus, the less people get sick. Next slide, please. So if we have 1/3 of patients with immunity, we can probably bring the effective RE down to about 1. So that's the key here with COVID. And we will talk much more about that later. Next slide, please. So these are the latest numbers for R naught, or RE, for COVID, and we'll talk more about this later. But I just wanted to show that this is variable depending on where you live in the country. So how else can we bring down an R naught to below 1? There are many, many things that we can do, specifically with this disease. If we have something that's respiratory, we wear a mask. Even for the flu, if we wore masks all winter long, we would have an R naught below 1. In winter season, if we don't get vaccinated against the flu, we are required to wear a mask. This is also another way to get the R naught below 1 is to have antibodies towards the virus. Another way to do it is to have killer T cells. And we will talk about all this next week. There's also vaccines and more to come. Last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ram. Okay.
Absolutely.
We're now at the point where we can address some questions. Let me ask one first, if I might. When you look at the COVID, it is reported that it has many different avenues of attack in the human body. Okay,
Yes.
There are many different medical outcomes. Is that common for viruses, or is that comparatively unusual?
In one way, it is pretty common for viruses to attack in different locations of the body. For example, flu not only can cause the upper respiratory symptoms, but can cause encephalitis, can cause other issues as well. COVID can do the same thing. Now, the way COVID probably does that is a little bit different than others because it causes what's called it causes the blood to coagulate. So if the blood coagulates, then you can cause strokes, you can cause heart attacks, you can cause other things. So it's pretty interesting how that can happen. And it's the same way if someone has vascular disease or some problem with their heart, they can also have strokes and other issues with their body because of the blood clots. So COVID does attack the body in multiple different ways, and also because the ACE2 receptor is pretty widespread throughout the body. It's not just in the lungs. So that's how we get blood pressure to get better. We don't actually use the ACE inhibitor on the lungs solely to get blood pressure better. We use it on the blood vessels. That's how the ACE inhibitor works. So if the ACE receptors are on blood vessels, well, guess what? COVID's going to attack the blood vessels too.
Lynn, you're muted. Do you have any questions for us? Lynn's been monitoring the questions. No questions at this point? Okay. One other one that had come in was an odd question from one of our scientists. Is there a purpose in the greater picture of things to a virus? Does a virus do anything? Can you describe what its purpose is?
That's a very philosophical question. What is the purpose of any being on Earth? Could be the same type of question. A virus is pretty much like any other being. Its purpose is to reproduce and become widespread. And I think that's, infect the whole world with the virus. That's that's the point of a virus. The problem with some viruses, like if you look at this virus in particular, the COVID virus, it is not very virulent in the sense that it's kind of 50% of people, or up to 50% of the people, don't actually get sick with it, right? So it's going around and infecting people, and people aren't even knowing. And that's part of its purpose, right? It's going around and trying to infect people and not know it's there and keep getting infecting throughout the world. So something that's not that virulent is something that's actually more effective in getting reproduced than something that is.
Okay. Jean Nat Campbell had a question. Jean?
Yes, I got lost. I'm not familiar with any of this, so I got lost in the middle about the difference among SARS-2, COVID-2, and COVID-19.
So it's SARS-2, or SARS-CoV-2 is that is the virus. That's the name of the virus. Okay. COVID-19 is the name of the sickness. So if you get the influenza virus, you get the flu, right?
Yes. Okay, so, thank you.
Absolutely.
George?
Yes.
Hi, it's Lynn, and there is a question on the emails that came into the Futures Club email site, and it was, what is the purpose of viruses? Are there beneficial purposes?
Can there be beneficial purposes of viruses?
Yeah, and what is the purpose of viruses being in our ecosystem?
We don't really know the main purpose of a virus being in the ecosystem. I think it's too weird of a little particle that we really know what its real purpose is. And there may be some that are beneficial, but the benefits of some viruses are that they actually can protect us from other viruses, honestly. And George, I think you were relating to this thing about the cowpox. And I won't steal your thunder, but that's a good example.
It's possible for viruses to hitchhike on bacteria. Do we have any evidence that that is a mechanism by which viruses enter the human body?
I haven't seen anything about that.
Okay. When we talk about the R0 or the RE, there are some mutations of the COVID virus. Okay, are we talking about that taken as a whole? Are there any differences that we know of between them, etc.?
I think it's too early to figure out which mutation does what. Okay. I think some mutations are worse than others, but for the most part, I think the R0 is about the same.
Okay. Um, is there any particular difference between a DNA virus and an RNA virus?
The main thing here is that they are both viruses and they both can infect our cells.
Okay.
There's a question on the chat. I don't know if you want me to answer this one.
Sure.
You guys can see that. My son was very sick but tested twice, negative twice. He had pink eyes and chest issues. I think he had COVID-19. What do you think? It depends when he was tested. If he was tested while he was sick, it's a possibility that he had COVID. I think that getting antibodies would be the ideal way to find out sooner rather than later.
Why are asthmatics and diabetics particularly prone to the COVID?
It's more because of breathing issues for the most part. And we don't know exactly why other than that, but breathing issues can be the main thing. And asthmatics, more asthmatics than diabetics can create a pretty good immune response. And the immune response in this sense initially is a good thing, but later in the stages is actually a bad thing because that's how people are dying from COVID. It's not actually the COVID or the SARS-CoV-2 virus killing people, it's actually the immune response, and that's what's killing people. So that may be the main thing why asthmatics are so prone to die from COVID-19 now. Diabetics, on the other hand, maybe don't have enough of an immune response initially. That's only my guess, though.
Okay.
I have a question. And this may be a dumb question. How do they look at a virus? I mean, how do they look at how do they know if it's a coronavirus? Can you tell that from putting it under a microscope, or what do they do to it to figure out what it is?
So they isolate it and use a electron microscope to see it. That's how they normally see it. Now, how do we know that someone that has the virus right now has the virus? They actually did some PCR testing, which isolates the DNA of the virus, and that's how they're testing the virus right now.
So you're saying there's a telescope? I mean, a microscope that you can look into and see the parts of the virus? That's amazing.
It's a very specific electron microscope.
Is there any evidence that coronaviruses can be dormant in humans?
Dormant. I haven't heard
that you would have gotten
but
it, and then there will be a later recurrence.
I haven't heard of that yet.
Okay.
Sandra has her hand up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sandra, you're on.
If you've had polio, for instance, or your polio vaccination or other such viruses, do they offer any protection against COVID-19?
No, usually not. It's just such a different virus. And we may have resistance against the polio virus, but no.
Okay.
Against the coronavirus.
Mona, did you have your hand up?
Yes. Is COVID-19 more infectious because it seems to be spreading much more rapidly than SARS or MERS?
Yeah, it definitely is more infectious. And the reason why it's more infectious is because it's actually less severe. So it's not killing people as much as SARS or MERS if you look at the percentage of people dying. And it's kind of hiding in people because people are asymptomatic. They're not getting any symptoms. So it's easily spread because you may not know that the person next to you has any symptom or may have it. And they are completely asymptomatic and they're just spreading it to people.
There's a lot of discussion about boosting the immune system, vitamin C, zinc, the whole list. Is there any evidence to support that?
I lost you for a second, George. What was the last part of the question?
Well, I'm just wondering, is there any real evidence that boosting the immune system helps to protect you from getting a virus?
So
to be specific about COVID.
So vitamin C, IV vitamin C has been tried, and this is mostly in people that are quite sick, but initially just taking your regular normal doses, like the 100% RDA of vitamin C and zinc every day, would be what would increase your, be what's recommended as far as protecting you against COVID for this. Now, they haven't shown to help, but having a good immune system is nonetheless a good thing.
So conceptually good, proof no.
Correct.
Is that fair?
That's right.
Okay. Do we actually have any evidence?
Peggy has her hand up.
I'm asking off the chat.
Yeah.
Do we actually have any evidence that antibodies will prevent reinfection from the virus?
We don't have any evidence yet. On the other hand, theoretically, they should. Now, how long they last, that's the question that we have. There are other things called T cells that can protect us from virus, and I'm not going to talk about that much right now because that's for the next section.
Peggy? Peggy, you're muted.
Oh.
I got you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I think you said something about zinc also being able to boost your immunity or boost your immune system. Is that what you said?
Yes.
Is there, if you took like, I don't know, whatever the recommended amount of zinc is, does that also help make you lose your sense of smell?
No,
No?
it shouldn't.
Okay. Thank you.
Following on the question about the zinc are there any other things that tend to improve immune systems in older people?
I think in everybody, vitamin D is very important as well.
Question we've all been watching, I'll just ask it on, how long can the virus remain viable in air and the sunlight?
There were some reports initially that the virus could stay on surfaces for 48 hours. It's possibly true that it could. On the other hand, the CDC guidelines at this point say that, and actually WHO say that having things on surfaces, it probably doesn't last very long at all. We don't know exactly how much. The initial studies seem to be a little bit flawed as far as how they did.
Okay. And Bennson has a question.
The 1918 flu seemed to affect young people, in their prime, let's say 20s, 30s.
Yes.
And this one is especially dangerous for older people, and young people don't get it at all sometimes. Do we know why that would be?
No, we don't know yet.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't know what's giving young people the protection that it is.
Okay, Jean has another question.
I saw a scientist interview who said there may be some indication that weight plays a part in, I don't know if it's whether people get COVID-19, but how they react to it or how sick they get. That people who are overweight or obese are more likely to suffer greatly. Is there any evidence to support that?
I think if you look at the statistics, it'll probably show that eventually. If you look at, the majority of people that are getting sick that are younger are usually more obese. And don't really know the reason for that, but my suspicion is that they probably have a lower initial immunity and actually have some sort of strong immune reaction towards the end because the virus gets into and also it's kind of the same idea as asthmatics. They have trouble breathing in the first place because they're more obese, and then this causes the system to just get overbearing.
There's a question from Gabriel and Lynn. There's always a discussion about viruses having diminished power during when it's hot and humid and all that, because that's our experience with the flu. Is there any logical thing behind that, or is that just depends on the virus and how it reacts and all of that?
So if we were all outside all the time, then the virus probably would not be going places in the southern states, India and Brazil, and if we kept 6 feet. On the other hand, if we were, the problem is that places that are warm, also people want to go inside, and that's where the virus gets spread easier. So it probably is less viable in heat and humidity, but that's so minimal as far as how much less it is that people still need to keep 6 feet and need to wear masks. And that's probably the biggest issue. So if we're within 6 feet and it's hot, it's still going to get to other people.
We've had a lot of questions about the immune system. Do you have any other comments you'd like to share with us about enhancing the immune system?
So the immune system should, and there's a couple questions here about how much vitamin D should be taken, and the vitamin D you should have a normal level. So that's hard to say because everybody's different. For me, I know I have to take more than other people just because even if I stand in the sun for an hour, my vitamin D level doesn't go up that much because I'm darker skinned. People that are lighter skinned don't need as much time in the sun. So it really depends. So if your level is normal, that's fine. It also depends on how much immunity or immune system reaction you have. Because it seems as though people with autoimmune conditions tend to eat up their vitamin D, or their vitamin D level seems to be lower. And I don't know, is that because people are in the sun or inside more, or are they, in the sun less? So does that mean that or that could also be that that's just the way it is. So just having a normal vitamin D level is important, and getting that checked from your primary care doctor or your other physician would be important.
Right.
George, it's Lynn, and I have 3 questions from Sohrab. One, is age alone a risk factor? 2, why have there been no vaccines against previously encountered coronaviruses? Did we not pursue that? And 3, is there any evidence that COVID-19 virus can do permanent damage as hepatitis C does?
So let me answer the number 3 first. Can COVID-19 actually cause permanent damage? Technically, the virus doesn't cause the damage, but the things that it can cause can cause a permanent damage. So one of the things it can cause, for the most part, is a lot of coagulopathy, or causing the blood to coagulate. So it can cause clots. That can cause strokes. That can cause damage to organs. That can cause other things. So yes, the virus can cause things that can cause issues that can be permanent. What was the second question was about the
why
virus
no
and,
vaccines, right, against previous coronaviruses?
Yes, so there was actually something in development, and that is one of the things that's actually being used to develop a coronavirus vaccine for this COVID-19. So there's actually a virus for MERS that was being developed, and that was, I think, at stage 2 at the time. So they actually modified that and now are being used for SARS-CoV-2. And then what was the first question?
And so Robbie's first question was, is age alone a risk factor? Are healthy seniors more at risk than healthy young adults?
Yes, healthy seniors are still at more risk. On the other hand, there are healthy seniors that recover or don't even get sick. So, truthfully, do we really know? I don't know. It just seems as though people that are slightly sick or have any comorbid conditions tend to get sicker with this. That is also the case with influenza and other things.
Sally had a question, and I'm going to modify it a little bit. Her question was, when people who are asymptomatic carry the virus, is that unpredictable or an extended situation, or is that temporary? The whole area of asymptomatic transmission, and we open that up to the broader picture of viruses in general. Is this something that we associate generally with the virus, or is this something that's somehow relatively unique for the COVID?
I think it's pretty common. We just don't know about it as much.
Okay.
So even influenza can be asymptomatic. Many people can have influenza and just be asymptomatic. We just don't know about it, and that's about 50%. So yes, that can be a pretty significant thing, and that can happen with any virus. I mean, even colds can be completely asymptomatic for some people and be pretty bad for some people. So,
Okay.
Christina, did you have a question? You're muted.
Thank you. The questions were combined. Thank you.
You're okay at this point? Okay. If you look at the COVID virus situation, okay, one of the things about the transmission has been the whole area of younger people being relatively asymptomatic and it falling very heavily on the elderly and the people with comorbidities. Again, is that something that you would consider to be relatively common for a virus? Or is that just something that we happen to be living with this particular one?
it's in particular this one, but there are many that can actually have asymptomatic transmission and transmission to elderly that can be more severe. For example, the flu is like that. The flu can be worse with adults that are older or younger adults or younger kids, I mean. And so, yeah, I mean, sometimes the illnesses are pretty asymptomatic for different age groups. And that's just, it's just the way some viruses are. That's weird. For example, some viruses are more severe for people that are actually younger and cause no illness in more elderly people. So it just depends. Depends on the virus.
Marlena, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you. I'm just wondering, will we get to a point when the COVID-19 transmission would slow down or what would be, is that a certain level of immunity that the population develops? How would we know?
Right. So the main thing is to have immunity. If a third of us have immunity, the COVID should slow down. And I think one of the things is in places that have had a lot of COVID, that may be why it slowed down quite a bit. Now, who knows how, if we can all get a vaccine, or 50% of us can get a vaccine, that would slow it down too. So.
Okay, I think we're reaching to the end of the questions. Marlena, you had a question.
I did. There are so many metrics that are used to report on COVID. There's hospitalization rates and deaths and infection rates. So of all of those, which is the most important, or are there other metrics we should also watch?
To me, I think the most important, and the problem is right now we're getting these data from all sorts of different organizations. And it's not only that, but some of the data is coming from one organization for some time, then it's changing to a different organization. And it can be quite flawed and skewed because initially we didn't have enough tests to test people that had COVID, and now we still may not have it. Anyway, the main thing to look at, in my perspective, is to look at hospitalizations and fatalities. And that gives us a better idea of what's going on, not the actual confirmed infections. Because the confirmed infections can be up to 10 times higher than what we're seeing. And that's what we found with antibody tests throughout the country. So, and that was actually in March and April. So it may be less than that now because we were better at as far as testing. But at the same time, the hospitalizations and fatalities are sort of the end results of infections. So if we're now, the problem is we still don't know how many people of the people that die, or what's the death rate essentially. So if we don't know the death rate or the hospitalization rate, because we don't know the actual denominator, how many people have the disease, we really don't know how many people have the disease despite those two metrics. On the other hand, those two metrics really tell us what's going on in the community.
Okay, Gabriel and Lynn have a question. You unmuted you, so I think you can ask it directly.
Yeah, there's the recent study that showed that children could have as high a load of the virus as adults. Now, I was wondering if that varies greatly by the age of the child, because we're all worried about what we tell our kids to do with our grandkids in school.
In my opinion, I think that we have to be careful with any person at any time because we really don't know the exact numbers for anything right now. So, do we know exactly which child is going to get it or not? We don't. Do we know who's going to be more susceptible? No. In this case, we can, as long as we can teach kids at home and they have some sort of ability to mingle with other people, even on Zoom. And if you teach your children right, in a few months, they're going to have socialization and everything like normal. So right now, my advice to children and actually everybody is you're going to be okay as long as you stay inside, but going outside and meeting other people, you have chances of getting this. And even if it's a 0.5% chance of death, that's not a good rate of death for anything.
Yeah, I'm going to wrap this up at this point. I have one final question, which I promised I would ask at the end. There are people here in Oakmont whose medical condition requires them to have home help, people who come into the home. And often these are people who care for other individuals, so they have multiple exposures. Other than advising that person to wear a mask and wash their hands, and is there any other advice you might give to such a person?
I think do the best with washing hands, keeping their distance as long as they're not requiring to help you, and also, of course, wearing a mask at all times. The other thing is that if you are in the house, it's your house, so you probably should wear a mask when they're around, but on the other hand, it's probably not going to make much of a difference as far as you contracting something from them as long as they're wearing a mask. So if you're going to wear a mask inside the house, it's probably better to wear it when there's someone else without a mask. You want to wear an N95. But they should be wearing a mask the whole time they're in your house.
Okay. Avi, thank you so
did you have a
much.
Question?
I'm going to close it out now. We've
Okay.
had our hour.
Okay.
Next week is vaccines. And the idea of next week is to look at the entire history of the development of vaccines and how they're used. There will also be a little bit of a discussion of the FDA approval process for a new vaccine, okay, because that's obviously an important part of what we're looking at. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll move on to the topic of the specific COVID vaccines. So thank you, Dr. Ram, and we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.